It happened in New York City, inside a small apartment we'd shared for 40 years. I wasn't looking for secrets, only for a receipt, but when I opened his wallet, something slid out that stopped my breath. A photograph. A boy. He looked exactly like our son at 8 years old. Same smile, same eyes. But I knew every photo ever taken of our child, and this wasn't one of them. That single picture turned my quiet evening into a storm. I'm glad you're here. Please like the video, subscribe, tell me where you're watching from, and drop a heart if this story moved you. It started with something as ordinary as folding laundry. His jacket was heavy, pockets stuffed with receipts and loose change. When I shook it gently to check for tissues, his wallet slid out and hit the floor. It opened when it landed, an old, brown leather one, softened by years of use. A few credit cards, some folded bills, and between them, a small square photograph. It fluttered out and landed face up on the carpet. I bent down, picked it up, and felt my chest tighten. The picture showed a young boy, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair, a crooked smile, and the same dimple our son had. At first, I thought it was one of our son's childhood photos, but something was off. The background looked different. Not our garden, not his school, not anywhere I recognized. The boy wore a shirt I'd never seen before, and the photo paper was older, yellowed at the edges. It looked like something taken decades ago. Still, the resemblance was so strong it made my stomach twist. The same spark in the eyes. The same way one eyebrow lifted higher than the other when smiling. For a moment, I felt dizzy, as if time had folded in on itself. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the photo trembling in my hands. My first thought was innocent. Maybe it was an old cousin's child, someone from his side of the family. But then the questions began. Why was it hidden in his wallet, tucked behind his cards, not framed or kept with the other family pictures? Why had I never seen it before, in all these years? The edges were worn, like he had taken it out many times. It wasn't something new. It had been with him for a long time. The air in the room felt heavy. I stared at the door, half expecting him to walk in. For a moment, I almost put the picture back and pretended I hadn't seen it. But something in me couldn't. I studied the back of the photo. Faint handwriting, barely visible. A name, maybe, or just a smudge from age. I tilted it toward the light, squinting. I could make out 2 words. The first looked like a name, Eli. The second was a town, or maybe a street, but it was too faded to read clearly. My hands began to shake. I put the wallet on the table, sat still for several minutes, trying to steady my breathing. Then, instinctively, I checked the compartments again. Behind the ID slot was a folded piece of paper, creased like it had been there for years. It was a receipt from a gas station 2 towns away, dated months ago. Nothing strange by itself, except he had told me he hadn't traveled outside the city in years. My mind started connecting pieces I didn't want to see. The long work trips, the quiet phone calls in the kitchen, the times he came home with that faraway look in his eyes, saying he was just tired. I placed everything back exactly as I found it. The photo, the cards, the paper, making sure nothing looked disturbed. But the damage was already done. I couldn't unsee it. Every memory we shared suddenly felt different, tinted by that small piece of paper I wasn't meant to find. The room around me looked the same curtains, same framed family pictures, but something had shifted inside me. I didn't know what the truth was yet, but I could feel it waiting, quiet and patient, like something buried under the floorboards. When he came home that evening, I watched him more closely. How he took off his shoes, checked his phone, placed his jacket on the chair. How casually he smiled, as if nothing in the world was wrong. And maybe for him, nothing was. Maybe he thought I'd never find it. I felt a cold calm settle over me, not anger yet, just awareness. I'd spent my whole life trusting him without question. Now, for the first time, I realized I didn't truly know him. Not the way I thought I did. That night, I couldn't sleep, Every time I closed my eyes, the boy's face appeared in the dark. His smile, those eyes, that resemblance that refused to make sense. I turned over again and again, listening to my husband's steady breathing beside me. I wanted to shake him awake and demand an explanation, but I didn't. I needed proof, not guesses. So I lay there, clutching the blanket, wondering who that child was, and why his picture had lived in my husband's wallet all these years. The next day felt heavier than usual, as if the air itself had thickened around me. Every sound, the kettle boiling, the clock ticking, even the soft thud of his shoes by the door, felt louder, sharper. My mind couldn't let go of that photograph. The boy's face was burned into my thoughts. Every time I blinked, I saw his smile overlapping with my son's, the same dimple forming on the right side of the cheek. It was impossible not to compare them. It was impossible not to wonder. I went about my morning quietly, folding towels, wiping the counter, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, I was on fire with questions. Why would my husband keep such a photo hidden? If it was innocent, a relative, a friend's child, why never mention it? After all, we'd been married for more than 40 years. We'd shared everything: bills, grief, our son's birth, even the quiet moments no one else saw. And yet here was something I didn't know, something that felt far too personal to be casual. When he came down for breakfast, I studied his face carefully. He looked the same, calm, routine, humming softly as he poured his coffee. There was no guilt, no nervousness, not even a flicker of discomfort. That, somehow, made it worse. He was too calm, too ordinary, as if nothing about the world had changed. I tried to speak, to ask something simple, but the words stuck in my throat. I wanted to sound casual, but I couldn't. My voice trembled when I finally said, "You carry old things in that wallet of yours, don't you?" He looked up, smiled quickly, and said something light, almost teasing. His answer slid past my question like water over stone. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He just avoided it with ease. That moment told me everything. Whatever that picture meant, he didn't want me to know. And that realization cut deeper than the photo itself. It wasn't just about who the boy was. It was about the wall that had suddenly appeared between us, tall and invisible. All day, I replayed our conversation, the half smile, the quick change of topic, the way he didn't look me in the eye for too long. My mind went back over little things I'd ignored for years. The trips he'd taken for work, though he'd been retired for some time. The quiet phone calls in another room. The mail that arrived with only his name on it. I had brushed those things off before, told myself every couple has their secrets, small or harmless. But this felt different. This was personal. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling again. The air felt colder than usual. He was already asleep, his breathing steady. I turned my head and looked at him in the dim light. The man I'd shared my life with, raised a family with, trusted with everything. And for the first time, I wondered if I truly knew who he was. Not the version I loved, not the man who fixed the door hinges and made me tea on Sundays, but the person he was when I wasn't looking. My mind wandered to our son, grown now, busy, living in another state. Did he know something I didn't? The thought made my stomach twist. No, I told myself. He would never keep something from me. But then again, my husband had. I thought about waking him up, demanding an explanation right there and then. But what if he lied? What if he said it was nothing and made me feel foolish? I didn't want denials. I wanted truth. Real, undeniable truth. Something I could see and hold in my hands. Something that would end the questions haunting me every second. As the hours passed, I realized the only way to get that truth was to find it myself. Whatever that boy's story was, whoever he was, it had been living quietly in my husband's wallet for years, maybe decades. And now that I knew, I couldn't let it rest. When morning came, I looked at my husband differently, not with anger, not yet, but with quiet suspicion. I made his coffee, set it down gently, and watched how he smiled, thanked me, and went about his morning as though everything was fine. Maybe for him it was, but for me, the world had tilted. I knew that the question I hadn't asked out loud would echo until I found the answer. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet of our living room, the glow from the lamp fell softly on the old family photographs lined along the shelf. Each one told a story: birthdays, school recitals, seaside trips. My eyes settled on a picture of our son at 8 years old, the same age as the boy in that mysterious photo. His messy hair, his gap-toothed grin, the way his father's hand rested proudly on his shoulder. It was impossible not to notice how similar the faces were, almost like two mirrors from different lives reflecting the same child. Our son had grown into a good man, busy, successful, living far away now. Calls had become fewer with time, just the occasional message on holidays. Still, he never forgot my birthday. His childhood had been filled with laughter and mischief, running through sprinklers in summer, bringing home stray cats, asking endless questions about everything. His father had adored him. They were inseparable once. Fishing trips, long walks, evenings spent fixing old furniture together. But something in that bond had faded over the years. I blamed work, distance, maybe pride. I never thought there could be another reason. Looking at those photos, I remembered the night our son left for college. My husband had hugged him tighter than usual, whispering something I couldn't hear. There were tears in his eyes, unusual for him. At the time, I thought it was just emotion, the weight of watching our boy grow up. But now, that memory carried a different kind of silence, maybe guilt, maybe something else entirely. I picked up another frame, our family portrait from when our son turned 10. We were all smiling, standing in front of the house we built together. My husband's hand rested on both our shoulders, protective and proud. But behind that image, I could now see something hidden, a shadow of distance I hadn't noticed before. He always seemed quieter after that year. Fewer jokes, fewer late-night talks. He started keeping to himself more, taking long drives alone, saying he needed time to think. I thought it was just midlife pressure. Now I wasn't sure anymore. The boy in the wallet, he had the same posture, the same bright eyes that carried both curiosity and calm. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was near identical. Every detail in that photograph seemed to whisper a question I wasn't ready to answer. Who was he? And why was he hidden from me for so long? I tried to remember every time my husband mentioned something about his past. He had been married before, briefly, before we met. A story he never liked to talk about. He said it ended without children, that the woman had left him for someone else. I had believed him. Never had I questioned his version of events. But now, sitting there surrounded by photographs of the life we built, I wondered if that story had been rewritten to protect him, or to protect me. Sometimes I caught him looking at old photo albums longer than necessary, tracing his finger along certain pages, his eyes distant. I thought it was nostalgia, a longing for simpler days. But now I realize nostalgia doesn't make a man hide a photograph in his wallet for decades. Regret does. The night stretched on. I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. I walked to our son's old room, untouched since he moved out. The bed still had the same quilt I had sewn when he was a boy, small patches of fading fabric from his baby clothes. The bookshelf still carried his childhood trophies and dusty comics. I sat down and looked around. It smelled faintly of cedar and old memories. That room was the heart of our home once. Every corner echoed with laughter and growing pains. I thought of the boy in the photograph again. Did he have a room like this somewhere else? Did someone tuck him in? Or did he stare at ceilings wondering about the man who carried his picture, but not his name? The thought pierced through me, cold and deep. If that boy truly was my husband's child, what kind of life had he lived? One built on secrets or silence? As the clock struck midnight, I realized I was no longer afraid of the truth. I was afraid of how long I had lived beside it, unaware. Love makes you blind, but time has a way of forcing your eyes open. And now, mine were wide awake. By the next morning, I couldn't ignore it any longer. Curiosity had grown into something heavier, a quiet, pulsing dread that followed me from room to room. My husband had already left for his morning errands, his usual calm routine masking whatever truth he was keeping. I stood by the coat rack where his jacket still hung from yesterday and stared at the pocket where the wallet had fallen. I didn't plan on snooping again, but my hands moved before my conscience could protest. I needed answers, not comfort. I opened the wallet carefully, trying not to disturb anything inside. The photograph was still there, folded neatly behind his ID, as if nothing had happened. My pulse quickened when I turned it over to look at the back again. The faded ink lines were clearer in the daylight now. The name, Eli, I could see that much. Beneath it, a second word, faint but readable under the right angle, Creston. It wasn't a name I recognized, not a friend or relative. It sounded like a place. I pressed my thumb lightly against the letters, as if touch alone could summon meaning from them. I took out a small notebook and wrote the words down. Eli, Creston. The handwriting on the photo didn't look recent. The ink was thin, perhaps ballpoint, maybe 20 years old or more. I knew then that this secret wasn't something new. It had roots. Deep ones. After returning the photo exactly as I found it, I sat down with my laptop and began to search. Creston. It turned out to be a small town in Missouri, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place no one visits unless they have a reason. Population just over 3,000, a post office, a few shops, a church, and a single school district. I stared at the map, tracing the main road, wondering what tied that tiny town to my husband's life. He had never once mentioned it. All his stories, all his memories had always circled around our own town, our own family, nothing about Missouri. I scrolled through old photos of Creston online, community fairs, school teams, town parades. My eyes scanned faces automatically, searching for anything familiar. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then one image caught my attention. A local newspaper archive photo from years ago, showing a Little League baseball team. The photo was grainy, but I recognized that same smile, that same uneven eyebrow. My breath caught. The caption read, Eli Turner, age 8, wins local championship. Turner. The name meant nothing, but the face was unmistakable. It felt like a door had opened inside my chest and cold air rushed through. The boy in the picture, the same boy in the wallet, wasn't a stranger. He was real, alive once in a town I'd never known, carrying a name that wasn't ours, but a face that was. I pushed the laptop away and sat in silence, gripping the edge of the table. Questions came in waves. Who was his mother? Why had my husband kept that secret all these years? Was the boy alive now, grown up somewhere, unaware of the family he mirrored? I tried to remember if we'd ever visited Missouri together. We hadn't. He'd been there once, decades ago, for what he called a business trip. I never thought to ask more. For a moment, I considered calling my son, telling him what I'd found, but what would I even say? Your father might have another son? Someone who looks exactly like you? No, I couldn't. Not yet. I needed proof, not pain. I searched for more records, school rosters, obituaries, anything. But the small town's online presence was thin. It was the kind of place where lives were lived quietly, without digital footprints. Still, I found one small mention, an article about a local fundraiser from years ago, listing a donor named Richard Collins. My heart skipped. That was my husband's full name. The one he never used, always preferring to go by Rick. I shut the laptop and leaned back, feeling the weight of the truth pressing closer. This wasn't coincidence anymore. My husband had a connection to that place, and that boy. Something in Creston belonged to him. I folded the paper with the notes and tucked it into my handbag. The next step was clear. I wasn't going to sit at home waiting for lies to surface. I would go there myself, find out what the photo meant, who Eli was, and why my husband had kept him hidden like a ghost. For years, I'd let my husband's version of the world be enough. But that morning, for the first time, I chose my own truth over his silence. The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. Every morning began the same way, with the sound of his car leaving the driveway before sunrise. He said he was meeting old friends, running errands, fixing paperwork that apparently couldn't wait. But I knew better now. I didn't confront him, not yet. I needed to see how far the lie would go when I pretended to believe it. Each evening, when he came home, I studied him quietly from across the table. His clothes smelled faintly of cologne he hadn't worn in years, and there was a calmness about him. Not guilt, but the kind of quiet a person wears when they think their secret is still safe. He smiled like a man who had nothing to hide, but his eyes told a different story. They didn't meet mine anymore. They wandered, always landing on the floor, the wall, anywhere but me. I kept my own routine steady, cooking, cleaning, pretending. But beneath the surface, everything was different. Every movement, every breath felt deliberate. I was no longer his wife waiting for answers. I was a detective gathering evidence. He didn't know it, but the silence between us had turned into my weapon. On the third day, I found a small receipt in his trouser pocket when I did the laundry. It was from a cafe, not in our town, but one in Missouri, the same state where that name on the photo had led me. My chest tightened when I saw the date. Just 2 days earlier. It wasn't coincidence anymore. My husband wasn't just keeping a secret, he was revisiting it. I folded the receipt and placed it back where I found it. If he noticed, he didn't mention it. He must have assumed I never looked. That evening, I watched him pour himself a drink, sit on the couch, and scroll through his phone like nothing in the world was wrong. Every small gesture, the clink of ice, the sigh between sips, seemed to mock my patience. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the clock tick, counting every second that separated us. For years, our marriage had been built on small routines, morning coffee, shared jokes, Sunday drives. But routine is easy when the truth isn't tested. Now, every simple act felt heavy, rehearsed, hollow. I wondered how many years this other life had existed parallel to mine, how many moments had been shared with someone else while I sat at home, trusting. By the 5th day, I'd stopped waiting for him to explain. His story was already written in his actions. Early mornings, secret calls, that distant look in his eyes. I spent my afternoons reading quietly by the window, though I didn't really read. I just needed to look busy so he wouldn't notice I was watching. Once, I saw him step outside to take a call. He turned his back to the house, hand gripping the phone tightly. I couldn't hear his words, but I saw his shoulders tremble slightly, like a man trying to control emotion. It wasn't anger, it looked like guilt. Later that night, when he thought I was asleep, I heard him in the hallway. His footsteps paused near my door, soft, uncertain. For a moment, I thought he might come in, sit down, tell me everything. But then the sound faded. He went downstairs instead. The front door opened and closed quietly, and I listened to the car engine fade into the distance. He didn't come back until dawn. That morning, I made him breakfast without saying a word. He thanked me absent-mindedly, like always, kissed my forehead, and left. It was strange how normal things looked when trust was already gone. I smiled as he drove away, not because I was calm, but because I finally knew what I had to do next. That silent week taught me more about truth than any argument ever could. Words lie, but patterns don't. He didn't know I'd seen the photo, or that I'd traced the town. He didn't know I had already written down the cafe name from the receipt and circled it 3 times in my notebook. I wasn't the kind of woman to shout or accuse. I'd spent my life holding this family together with quiet strength. Now, I would use that same quiet to uncover everything. The truth was out there, in that small town, in that cafe, maybe in the eyes of a boy who looked too much like my own. The morning I left for Creston, the sky hung heavy with low clouds, the kind that promised rain but never delivered. I packed light, a change of clothes, my notebook with all the notes I'd gathered, and the quiet determination that had grown inside me over that silent week. My husband thought I was visiting a friend in the next town. I let him believe that. Lies could serve their purpose when told for the right reasons. The bus ride was long, nearly 6 hours of quiet roads and shifting scenery. Towns blurred past the window, faded gas stations, abandoned barns, empty fields stretching for miles. It felt almost symbolic, as though the land itself was emptying of truth, daring me to find it again. My mind wandered back to the boy in the photo, Eli. I tried to imagine his voice, his age now, whether he knew who his father was. Did he even exist anymore? Or was that picture the only proof left of a hidden life? When I finally arrived, Creston was smaller than I'd imagined. One main street ran through the town, lined with old brick buildings and shop fronts that looked frozen in another decade. There was a small park, a white church, and a single diner with a sign that read, Maggie's Cafe, home of the best pie in Missouri. It was the same cafe printed on the receipt I'd found in my husband's pocket. My heart sank and quickened all at once. He had been here recently. I pushed open the door, and the faint ring of the bell over the entrance startled me. The air smelled of coffee and buttered toast. Behind the counter stood a young waitress, maybe in her 20s, wiping down tables with slow, steady movements. I sat near the window, ordered tea, and waited. She smiled politely and brought my cup over. When I handed her the photograph, her expression changed immediately. "I know him," she said softly, pointing at the boy. "That's Eli. He used to come here with his dad all the time when I was a kid." Her words hit like a slow thunderclap. "His dad?" I asked, careful not to sound too eager. She nodded. "Mr. Collins. He worked out by the railway office for years before moving away." My hands trembled as I took back the photo, my husband's surname, the one he'd abandoned long before he met me, Collins. He hadn't just visited this town recently. He had lived here once. He had built another life before mine, one he'd buried and renamed. I thanked her quietly, paid for my tea, and stepped outside into the still air. The truth had found its first breath. The boy had been real. My husband hadn't carried that photo out of guilt or nostalgia. He carried it because that child was his. I walked to the edge of the park across the street. The grass was freshly cut, and children played near a swing set. One boy, around the same age as the photo's child, laughed as he chased a red ball across the field. His laughter echoed through me, the same bright, unfiltered sound I once heard from our son when life was still simple. I stood there for a long time, frozen between past and present, between the boy who grew up under my roof and the one I'd just learned existed somewhere in this town. When the church bells rang, I looked up and noticed a small newspaper office beside the diner. Its window displayed old headlines and faded community photos. I went inside. The editor, an older man with kind eyes, recognized the name immediately when I asked about Eli Collins. He pulled out a few boxes from the archive and said, "That family left years ago, after, well, things got complicated." The father stopped showing up one day. I flipped through the old papers, scanning quickly until one article caught my attention. Local worker injured in rail accident, leaves behind son and partner. The date matched the time my husband had met me, almost to the year. My throat tightened. He hadn't left that family. He'd lost them. But instead of grief, he'd replaced the pain with silence. And now, decades later, that silence had grown into deceit. As the day turned to dusk, I sat on a bench by the bus stop, holding the photo once more. My husband's secret wasn't just about infidelity. It was about unfinished love, buried shame, and the boy who paid the price for it. By the time the bus arrived, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live another day pretending ignorance was peace. When I returned home, I would not ask for the truth. I would show him that I already knew it, and that this time he'd have to face it. When I returned home, the house felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves knew what I had learned. My husband was in the living room, reading the newspaper, glasses perched on his nose, the same calm mask he always wore. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, thinking about how many times I'd walked into this room as his wife, and how this time I was walking in as his witness. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I placed my bag on the table, pulled out the photograph, and laid it down between us. It landed face up, the boy's smile frozen in time. The color drained from his face almost instantly. He didn't even look at me. His eyes locked on that photo as though it had crawled out of his past and into his present. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock. When he finally looked up, there was no point pretending. His lips parted, but no words came. His eyes flickered with something between shock and surrender. I had expected anger, excuses, even denial. But what I saw was grief, old grief, buried and reshaped into the man I thought I knew. He reached for the photo with trembling hands, held it gently, and whispered something under his breath I couldn't hear. That's when I realized I didn't need to ask who the boy was. I already knew. He sat down, shoulders sagging, and spoke softly, as though afraid of breaking something invisible between us. He told me the truth, every bit of it. Before we met, long before our marriage, he had fallen in love with a woman in that small town, Creston. They'd had a child together, a boy, but tragedy had struck before the boy could even start school. The woman had passed suddenly, and my husband, unable to cope, left the town and never looked back. He'd sent money for years to the boy's relatives, but eventually life moved him elsewhere. Then he met me. The more he spoke, the quieter the room became. I stood by the window, staring out at the fading daylight. Each word hit with its own weight, not of betrayal, but of sorrow. He hadn't been unfaithful to me. He had been unfaithful to his own pain. He'd built our life on top of a buried chapter, never telling me, never letting me carry even a piece of that burden with him. When he finished, I turned back to him. There was nothing left to ask. His face was pale, almost gray, as though years of guilt had finally surfaced. The silence between us wasn't cruel. It was heavy with understanding. He didn't need my forgiveness. He needed to face the cost of his secrecy. I picked up the photo again and placed it in his hand. "You should go see him," I said simply. My voice was calm, almost detached. I think it surprised us both. He stared at me for a long time, as if expecting anger that never came. But what I felt wasn't rage. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes after years of carrying someone else's half-truths. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room long after he went upstairs, staring at the shadows stretching across the carpet. I thought about all the times he'd told me stories of his youth, carefully edited, always avoiding anything too specific. I realized that the man I married had always lived between two worlds, one built on love, the other on silence. And now, after decades, those worlds had collided. In the morning, I found him at the kitchen table, the photo beside his coffee cup. He looked older somehow, as if confession had aged him overnight. Without a word, he told me he would drive to Creston that week. He didn't know if the boy, now a man, would want to see him, but he had to try. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. When he left for work that day, he paused at the door and looked back at me, not as a husband, but as someone who had finally stopped hiding. And though my heart still ached, I felt something shift inside me. The truth hadn't destroyed us. It had changed us. Later, as I stood by the window watching his car disappear down the road, I realized that some betrayals aren't about lies. They're about the years stolen by silence, the love withheld, the truth unspoken. The day after his confession, the silence in our house felt different. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was hollow, like something had been removed, leaving behind an echo of what used to be. I walked through the hallway and stopped by the framed photos on the wall. There was our wedding picture, our son's graduation photo, and one of our family holidays by the lake. All of them were smiling moments, and yet they looked staged now, like portraits hiding the parts of us that were too inconvenient to display. He came home early that afternoon, carrying a small box. I recognized it immediately, the same one he used to keep his old documents and letters in. He placed it on the table without saying a word, then opened it slowly. Inside were envelopes, yellowed with age, each marked with a name and a date. I realized they were letters he had written to that boy, the one from the photograph, but never sent. Some were decades old, others newer, with handwriting that grew shakier over time. I picked one up carefully and read the first line. "I hope you're taller than me now." My hands trembled as I turned the page. He explained that every month, for nearly 20 years, he had written to his son. But he never mailed them. The letters became his punishment and his comfort. Proof that he remembered, but couldn't face what remembering cost him. The relatives who had raised the boy never answered his attempts to reach out. They wanted distance, believing it was better for the child. So, he buried the truth instead, carrying it like a quiet illness that never went away. As I read, I understood what that silence had done to him. It had shaped the man I knew, the one who avoided certain questions, who smiled a little too tightly when people mentioned family, who stayed up at night pretending to read, but really just stared into space. His secret had not only stolen years from that boy, it had taken pieces of our marriage too. We had lived side by side for decades, but there had always been a wall between us that neither of us could name. The hardest part was realizing how easily I might have forgiven him, if only he had told me sooner. I wasn't angry about the past anymore. What hurt was being excluded from it, being denied the chance to share his pain when I had shared everything else. He thought he was protecting me, but all he'd really done was build a life on top of unfinished grief. That night, after dinner, he sat beside me in the living room. We didn't speak much. Words had lost their meaning. Instead, he handed me one final letter, sealed but never addressed. "This one," he said quietly, "was for you." I opened it carefully, the paper soft from being handled too many times. Inside were just a few lines, written in his older handwriting. "If you ever find out, please remember that the boy I lost made me the man you met. I never wanted to hide him from you, only the part of me that failed him." For the first time since discovering that photograph, I cried. Not from anger, but from the weight of understanding. His secret had been both selfish and human. People think betrayal always comes from cruelty, but sometimes it's born from fear, the fear of being unloved once the truth is spoken aloud. Over the next few days, we talked more than we had in years. He told me about the boy's mother, how kind she was, how she had reminded him of me in small ways. I didn't feel jealousy, only sadness. There was something deeply tragic about realizing that love can exist in multiple lives, but never at the same time. I told him that if he truly wanted peace, he had to face the past in person. He nodded slowly, as if he'd already decided. He spent the evening sorting through the letters, arranging them neatly in chronological order. I watched from across the table, memorizing the lines on his face. There was relief there, mixed with exhaustion. Secrets age people faster than time ever could. Before we went to bed, I asked him one question. "If you could do it again, would you tell me from the start?" He hesitated, then said, "Yes, but I don't think I would have deserved your kindness back then." His honesty was painful, but it was real. That night, as I turned off the lights, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Empathy. Not for the man he pretended to be, but for the man he truly was. For years, I thought love meant protecting each other from pain. Now I knew that love also meant sharing it, even when it breaks you a little. The day he finally went to meet the boy, the sky was overcast, the kind of muted gray that makes everything feel fragile. He left early, wearing the same navy coat he used to wear when visiting our own son in college. I stood by the window, watching him reverse out of the driveway, my heart caught between fear and relief. For years, he had carried a ghost inside him. Now, at last, he was going to face the living proof of that past. He didn't ask me to go with him, and I didn't offer. Some journeys have to be walked alone. The hours dragged by slowly. Every car that passed made me flinch. Every tick of the clock echoed louder. By evening, when he finally returned, I saw it on his face. Something had changed. His eyes were red but lighter, like someone who had finally been allowed to exhale after decades of holding his breath. He sat down across from me, silent for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. Then, with a voice almost too quiet to hear, he said, "He looks just like him." He didn't need to say who. I knew he meant both of them, our son and the one he'd hidden. He told me everything. He'd gone back to Creston and found the address through the cafe owner, Maggie, the same woman who'd recognized the photograph. The boy, now a man in his 30s, worked as a mechanic, living a modest life with his wife and little girl. My husband had stood outside the shop for nearly an hour, too nervous to approach. When he finally walked in, the young man looked up from under the hood of a car and froze. The resemblance was undeniable. He had his father's eyes, the same half-smile, even the same way of folding his arms when listening. They didn't embrace right away. Instead, they talked, for hours, about his mother, about the years lost, about the questions that had never been answered. The boy, Eli, as I'd learned his name was, said he had always known there was more to the story, that his relatives had mentioned a father who sent letters but never returned. My husband told him the truth, all of it. No excuses, no pretense, just quiet honesty. He said Eli didn't cry or shout. He simply sat in silence, then placed a small, faded envelope on the table. Inside was one of the old letters my husband had sent all those years ago, one of the few that had actually reached him. When my husband finished telling me this, he fell quiet again, staring down at his hands. I reached across the table and touched his wrist gently. He didn't flinch. There was peace in his silence now, not the heavy kind that hides guilt, but the stillness that comes after confession. The next week, Eli came to visit. When he stepped through our doorway, I felt something inside me shift. It was like looking at a reflection from another timeline, the same features as our son, but a different story written in his eyes. He was polite, hesitant, almost shy. I offered him tea, and he smiled, that same crooked smile I had fallen in love with on his father's face decades ago. We sat in the living room, and the conversation came naturally, gently. He told us about his daughter, his work, his life in Creston. There was no resentment in his voice, only quiet curiosity. I realized then that forgiveness isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it arrives in soft tones and shared glances. Sometimes it just walks in, sits down, and asks for tea. When he left, he hugged his father, a long, trembling embrace that said more than words ever could. I watched from the doorway, my chest tightening as years of silence dissolved in that single moment. For the first time, I saw my husband cry, not from guilt, but from relief. That night, after Eli drove away, we sat together by the fireplace. My husband held the photograph, the same one that had once shattered our peace, and placed it beside the picture of our family on the mantel. "Now it belongs here," he said softly. And for once, I agreed. The secret that once divided us had become the thread that mended something deeper. Our home didn't feel like a museum of mistakes anymore. It felt alive again, filled with memory and truth instead of shame. The boy in the picture wasn't a ghost anymore. He was family. That night, long after everyone had gone to sleep, I sat alone by the window, watching the streetlights flicker outside. The photo still sat on the mantel beside our family pictures, two worlds finally sharing the same frame. For years, I thought the truth would destroy the life we built. But looking at that photograph now, I realized something deeper. It hadn't destroyed anything. It had simply revealed what was already broken and given us a chance to rebuild it honestly. People often talk about betrayal as if it's only about lies. But sometimes the real betrayal is silence, the way it steals time, the way it forces love to live in shadows. My husband didn't cheat on me. He cheated himself out of forgiveness for decades. And in doing so, he cheated me out of knowing the man he truly was. The truth didn't ruin us. It simply stripped away the illusion that everything had always been fine. In the days that followed, our home felt different. Not louder or happier, but real. The walls no longer echoed with unspoken things. We started having coffee together every morning, just sitting quietly, sometimes talking about the past, sometimes about the weather. It was simple, ordinary, and that's what made it precious. I found that I could look at him again without resentment, because now, when I saw him, I didn't see the man who hid something from me. I saw the man who finally had the courage to stop hiding. One afternoon, he told me he'd been invited to Eli's home for dinner. I went with him this time. When we arrived, Eli's little daughter ran up to her grandfather, calling him by name. Not Mr. Collins, not Sir, just Grandpa. The way his eyes softened in that moment made everything worth it. For the first time in years, I saw peace on his face. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from acceptance. I watched him laugh with Eli, both of them fixing a toy car at the table, heads bent in the same concentration. They didn't need words to connect. Blood had already done that. I realized then that healing doesn't always come as an apology or a confession. Sometimes it comes quietly, through generations, through the way love finds its way back even after being lost for decades. When we got home that night, he looked at me and said, "Thank you for not leaving when you could have." I smiled, but I didn't answer, because forgiveness, once given, doesn't need to be repeated. It lives quietly in the spaces between words, the same way truth does. Now, when I pass that photo in the living room, I don't feel pain anymore. I feel pride. Pride that I didn't let anger win. Pride that our story, though cracked, still stands. And pride that a child who grew up without a father's presence now knows the warmth of a family that finally faced its own truth. To anyone listening to my story, I want you to understand something. Secrets are like locked doors in a house you already live in. You can ignore them for years, but eventually, the silence starts to creak, and you can't rest until you open it. Sometimes what you find behind it will break your heart, but sometimes it will set it free. So tell me, if you found a secret hidden in someone you love, would you walk away to protect yourself? Or would you stay long enough to let the truth heal what the lie tried to hide? If you're still here listening, I want to thank you. Please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story touched something inside you, drop a heart. Because maybe, just maybe, love doesn't die when we find out the truth. Maybe it finally begins.